Seattle General in Raleigh doesn't sleep. It breathes. Ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm through the ICU corridors at night, a sound like something metal struggling to stay alive. The fluorescent lights hum at frequencies that most people stop hearing after an hour, but Hannah Clarke has been hearing it for 8 months, and the hum has become a kind of comfort, a sign the machines are working, the patients are monitored, the night is passing as it should. She arrives at 11:08 p.m., 43 minutes before her shift officially begins. This is deliberate. The day shift nurse, Marcus, always leaves at 11:30 regardless of how the handoff is going, and Hannah learned quickly that arriving early meant reading the charts herself rather than accepting someone else's abbreviated version. For patients tonight: 3 stable, 1 complicated. Room for 07 belongs to Marine General Robert Kaine, admitted 72 hours ago with a massive PE, a pulmonary embolism, the kind that shows up on the EKG as a sinus tachycardia and a sudden, crushing sense that something fundamental has changed. The general had been admitted to the regular floor first, but his O2 saturation had been steadily declining, and by day 3 they transferred him here to the ICU where someone could watch his vitals with the kind of attention that prevents the worst from happening. Hannah knows his chart the way she knows her own breathing. 74 years old. Retired after 41 years of active service. Commanded the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse, during deployment in Raleigh. The kind of man whose presence changes the gravity in a room. She reads the notes from the attending physicians, their descriptions of his condition rendered in a clinical shorthand that strips away personhood, BP stable at 118/76 on current anticoagulation regimen, O2 sat 94% on 3L nasal cannula, mild dyspnea with exertion, advancing mobilization per PT recommendations. What they don't mention is that this man had commanded her son's unit. That he had written the letter that arrived 3 weeks after the IED. That he had held the same name that was written on the memorial wall at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, 2 states over. She reaches into her scrub pocket and touches the small triangle of fabric folded with military precision. Not her son's flag, that one sits in a box she cannot open, tucked on the top shelf of her closet between winter coats. This flag belonged to Corporal Marcus Chen, her son's closest friend, the one who had been 2 meters away when the device detonated. The general had sent her a handwritten note with a photograph of Corporal Chen in dress blues, smiling at something someone had said just before the camera clicked. The general's signature had been bold and steady, *, he was the best kind of Marine. Your son was fortunate to serve beside him. *. Hannah does not believe in luck. She believes in attention to detail, in the small interventions that prevent catastrophe, in the kind of discipline that catches problems before they become emergencies. She has been a nurse for 9 years, but before that she was something else, and before that something else still, and the woman who arrives at Seattle General in Raleigh in her immaculate dark blue scrubs and her badge clipped to her collar is the sum total of every identity she has ever worn. She enters room 407 at 11:52 p.m. The general is sleeping, his chest rising and falling with the even rhythm of someone whose body is healing. The ventilator is off tonight, a good sign. She checks the foresight first, running her eyes along the line for any sign of infection or infiltration. Clean. She checks the cardiac monitor, sinus rhythm, rate 68, regular as a metronome. She adjusts the oxygen to ensure optimal flow and glances at his face in the darkness. Even in sleep, there is something about the set of his jaw that speaks of a life spent making decisions that affected thousands of people. Decisions about who came home and who didn't. She reaches into her pocket and lets her fingers rest on the folded flag. Not a ritual. Observation. A moment of stillness before the night begins in earnest. She is standing there, motionless, when Dr. Pierce appears in the doorway. He doesn't announce himself. He simply materializes the way certain people do, with the expectation that the world will rearrange itself around their presence. Dr. Pierce has been the attending in the ICU for 6 months, overlapping with Hannah's time here by 2 months, and in those 2 months he has made it clear that her presence in this hospital is a mistake that has not yet been corrected. Nurse Clarke. His voice is the kind that fills a room without raising in volume. That's not part of your job description. She doesn't move her hand. She doesn't look at him. She simply removes her fingers from her pocket and turns to face him with an expression of complete neutrality. Adjusting oxygen flow. Monitoring sleep cycles. Part of ICU protocol. Monitoring. His smile suggests he has caught her in some fundamental dishonesty. You were standing there, holding his flag. That's not monitoring, nurse. That's... He pauses, searching for the word. Contaminating the clinical environment with sentiment. The phrase is carefully chosen. Clinical environment. Contaminating. As if her presence is the problem, not the systems that might fail if she weren't paying attention. The flag remains in my pocket. The General's fabric integrity is uncompromised. She moves to check before sight again, movements precise. Every motion is economical, calculated to convey both competence and indifference. His O2 saturation is stable. Vitals are strong. Dr. Pierce steps fully into the room now, positioning himself between Hannah and the door. It is a calculated move, the kind of spatial dominance that people use when they want to establish hierarchy without saying anything explicit. I've been reviewing your file, Nurse Clarke. Your previous employment history is sparse. And your references are accurate. Are they? His voice drops slightly, which somehow makes it more threatening. Because I made some calls today. To Sacred Heart in Portland, where your file claims you worked for 4 years in critical care. Interesting thing happened when I called them. They had no record of a Hannah Clarke. No current record, no archived record. Nothing. Hannah's hands continue their systematic check of the General's full line, even though she has already verified it twice. The silence in the room extends for exactly 3 seconds. Then she speaks, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived things that would break most people. Some hospitals purge older employment records. Different systems. Different retention policies. Or, Dr. Pierce says, moving closer to the bed, you fabricated your credentials. Which would explain why someone with your supposed background is working the night shift on a general floor when you should be in leadership. It would also explain your behavior. He gestures vaguely at her. The lingering. The hand-holding. The emotional investment in patients instead of the clinical protocols that move bodies through the system efficiently. Hannah turns to face him fully now. There is nothing in her expression, no anger, no defensiveness, no fear. Her eyes are the color of a winter sky, and they don't blink. The General's BP was 94/52 when he was admitted. Weak pulse. Borderline septic. Day shift was considering palliative care protocols. I adjusted fluid intake by 300 milliliters and caught an infection before it became systemic. His vitals are now stable for the first time since admission. That's clinical. That's protocol. That's inference without authorization. That's nursing. The room goes so quiet you can hear the fluorescent lights hum, a high-pitched frequency that most people's brains train themselves to ignore. Dr. Pierce's jaw tightens. His eyes narrow slightly. He is not accustomed to being contradicted by someone in a subordinate position, and the fact that Hannah has done so with perfect courtesy makes it somehow worse. We'll see, he says finally, stepping back from the bed. I'm going to be reviewing your clinical decisions more closely, Nurse Clarke. All of them. Your charting, your interventions, your bedside manner. Because I don't believe you are who you claim to be, and I don't believe you got here through legitimate channels. The hospital has standards. Hannah waits until he reaches the doorway. Then she speaks one final time, her voice steady and quiet. Your concerns are noted, Doctor. General Kaine needs rest. So do his monitors. It is not a dismissal. It is not quite insubordination. It is the exact tone of someone who has absorbed insults with controlled fury and chosen to make her response cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. Dr. Pierce leaves, and Hannah remains at the bedside, her hand back in her pocket, touching the folded flag that belongs to a young Marine who never came home. The night shift extends before her like all the other nights. 3 more hours until dawn. Vitals to monitor. Charts to update. The general breathing steadily in the darkness. She has survived 8 months in this place, 8 months of what it takes to remain invisible, to never show the seams of a person designed for something far more demanding than a floor position in a hospital in North Carolina. 8 months of answering to a man who sees weakness where there is only discipline. 8 months of preparing for exactly what Dr. Pierce has begun. What he doesn't know is that the woman standing in room 407 has held the lives of soldiers in her hands. Has made decisions in the dark with only her instinct and her training. Has buried teammates and walked away from funerals to finish the mission. Has done this not once but many times over, and the reason her hands never tremor during a code is not because she lacks emotion, it is because emotion is a luxury she surrendered a very long time ago. She settles into the chair beside General Kaine's bed and begins the night watch. By morning, everything will change. But for now, there is only the hum of the machines and the steady rise and fall of a man's chest, and the small triangle of fabric in her pocket that means she has failed at nothing yet. Morning rounds at Seattle General. 6:45 a.m. The kind of light that hasn't decided if it's dawn yet, hanging grey and undecided through the ICU windows. Hannah stands at the foot of Marine General Robert Kaine's bed with her overnight report folded in a chart jacket, vitals precise and documented in her careful handwriting. Oxygen saturation 94% on 2 liters. Blood pressure 126/80. Heart rate stable. The general's daughter and son-in-law stand by the window, coffee cup steaming, watching the machines with the helpless focus of people who don't understand what the numbers mean. They just know their father is still breathing. That's enough. Dr. Pierce rounds the corner at 6:48. He moves like a man who owns the hallway. Wool slacks that cost more than Hannah's monthly rent. A silk tie the color of old money. His shoes click against the tile with the rhythm of authority. He doesn't glance at the patient first. He looks at Hannah, and something in his expression says he's been waiting for this moment since yesterday. Since she showed up at General Kaine's bedside with a flag in her pocket and a kind of reverence that made him certain she was dangerous. Interesting assessment, Nurse Clarke, Pierce says, stopping at the monitors without reading them. His voice carries the particular brightness of a man who's already decided what he thinks. Tell me, where exactly did you say you trained? Hannah meets his eyes. Flat. Composed. My credentials are on file with HR, doctor. Right. He laughs. Not a warm sound. A weapon disguised as amusement. HR. The same department that hired a night shift floor nurse with supposedly impeccable references but who somehow ended up here instead of any ICU that would actually value such remarkable skills. He turns to the general's daughter, and his voice becomes almost sympathetic. I apologize for Nurse Nightingale here. She means well, but I've noticed she's becoming emotionally compromised. I've observed her practically weeping at your father's bedside. The daughter's face tightens. The son-in-law looks away. Hannah's jaw works once. Twice. Her hands stay flat against her sides. The flag in her scrub's pocket feels heavier than it should. I know exactly what these monitors measure, doctor, she says quietly. Her voice has dropped an octave. There's something underneath it now, something that sounds nothing like a junior nurse. Including how long you've been talking instead of treating. She doesn't wait for a response. She turns and walks out. Her shoes click against the tile in perfect rhythm. Measured. Unstoppable. Nobody moves until the sound of her footsteps disappears down the corridor. Pierce stands in the silence, his face darkening like a storm front. He's used to the last word. He's used to women in white coats backing down. He's not used to being dismissed from a room like his opinion is weather, something to endure until it passes. By 7:30, the break room at Seattle General is the color of fluorescent purgatory. Bad coffee in a metal pot. A microwave that smells like every reheated meal from the last 6 months. Hannah sits at the table with her sandwich, turkey, no condiments, the food of someone on a mission who doesn't have time to taste, and 5 other people suddenly remember they have places to be. 2 stand up and leave without speaking. A third rinses her cup with deliberate slowness, avoiding eye contact. By the time Hannah's fork is halfway to her mouth, the table is empty except for Karen, one of the respiratory therapists, who whispers to her leaving companion. EPS says she probably forged her references. Can you imagine? A whole nurse who doesn't actually exist. Hannah eats her sandwich with mechanical precision. Her jaw works like a piston. Her eyes stay fixed on the table in front of her. The sandwich tastes like nothing. She finishes it anyway. That's discipline. That's what Captain Hannah Clarke learned in 2010 and 2011 and 2012 in Ramadi, where you ate when you could because you didn't know when you'd eat again, and showing emotion was the same as giving the enemy intelligence about your supply lines. By 2 o'clock, the unit board outside the nursing station has a fresh document pinned to it. White paper. Official letterhead. Red text, disciplinary notice. Hannah stops in front of it. She reads it once. She reads it twice. The words arrange themselves into something she's learned to expect. Unprofessional conduct toward attending physician. Possible credential misrepresentation. Under review pending investigation. Her name. Her shift. Today's date. She unpins it slowly. Folds it exactly in thirds. Slides it into the same pocket as the flag. The 2 pieces of paper sit against her ribs like accusations waiting to become truths. A resident passes, someone new, someone who doesn't know her, and mutters to his fellow, faker finally getting caught. I heard she made up half her credentials. Hannah doesn't turn. Doesn't respond. Her hands stay steady. Her breathing stays even. She walks to the medication room and closes the door and allows her hands to shake for exactly 5 seconds. Just 5. The tremor moves through her palms like a transmission of fear that she processes and discards the way a soldier learns to. Fear is information. Fear is data. Fear is useful if you don't let it control you. When her hands are still again, she moves to the Pyxis and begins pulling for bags for the evening. Her movements are precise. Practiced. The muscle memory of someone who has done this so many times it feels like breathing. 2 liters normal saline. 1 liter D5W. 1 unit of packed red blood cells. The work is routine. The work is what keeps her sane. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part comes at 8:15 p.m. when the investigating nurse, someone senior who's always been kind to Hannah, pulls her into the supply closet and says, "I'm sorry. I had to answer their questions truthfully. I told them you started in June. I couldn't lie." The closet smells like bleach and cardboard. Like the smell of institutions trying to clean their way out of guilt. Hannah nods and says nothing because what is there to say? The investigation is happening. The institutional machinery is grinding forward. In 12 hours, maybe 24, someone from the state nursing board is going to start asking questions she can't answer without burning everything. 8 months of operational groundwork. The supply diversion ring that's been funneling controlled substances to dealers in 3 counties. The medical equipment that's been disappearing from loading docks and showing up in black markets. All of it connected by a thread so thin that pulling on it has to be done with precision, with patience, with time. She doesn't have time anymore. By evening shift change, the nurses on the day team have mostly stopped looking at her. The ones who make eye contact do it with pity. The ones who don't make eye contact do it because they've been told not to. The break room has developed a new geography. Hannah's usual seat is empty now. People sit at the opposite end of the table if she arrives. If she's already sitting, they eat standing up or take their breaks elsewhere. She watches this happen with the detachment of someone observing a mechanism she understands completely. Social isolation is a predictable weapon. It's how groups enforce obedience. Remove someone from the tribe and they become manageable. Remove them enough and they eventually leave on their own. But Hannah Clarke has survived things that would have destroyed most people. She has walked through ambush corridors in Fallujah where the walls were thin enough that insurgent rounds came through like angry bees. She has held pressure on wounds that shouldn't have been survivable. She has made decisions in 40 seconds that other people don't make in a lifetime. A hospital break room with cold shoulders and careful silences is not a threat. It's background noise. At 9 p.m., she's in General Kaine's room doing evening vitals. His eyes are closed, but his breathing is steady. His monitors show a man whose body is healing, whose trauma is being managed, whose marine physiology is doing what marine physiology does, persisting. She records his oxygen saturation. She adjusts his flow rate. She does the work that Dr. Pierce has implied she's not qualified to do. And somewhere in the machinery of Seattle General, in offices and email threads and phone calls that Hannah will never hear, the process continues. The investigation is being activated. The calls are being made. The pieces are being moved on a board she can't see. What she doesn't know yet is that everything is about to accelerate. That the night shift holds something none of them have anticipated. That the general's body is about to betray him in a way that will either prove Hannah's competence conclusively or destroy her entirely. The monitors hum their steady rhythm. She checks them one more time before she leaves the room. Everything is stable. Everything is normal. For now. The alarm screamed at 0200. Not the soft reminder beep of a routine alert. This was the full-throated shriek of a monitor in free fall, the sound that made nurses' heads snap up like startled prey. Hannah was halfway through charting when it hit, 3 floors up, ICU, bed 7. General Kaine's bed. She moved before conscious thought caught up. The stairwell was faster than the elevator. Her shoes hit the tile in a rhythm, up, 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 and by the time she reached the 3rd floor landing, she already knew what she'd find. Oxygen saturation didn't plummet on its own. Neither did tracheas shift sideways in the neck. The ICU doors hissed open. The chaos was organized at first, nurses gathering, monitors screaming in a discordant chorus, the ventilator still pumping air into lungs that couldn't receive it. But Hannah's eyes went straight to the general's chest. The skin around his right collarbone had taken on the gray, sunken look of a cavity. Like the air was being sucked into a space where it didn't belong. Tension pneumothorax. The code team was 8 minutes out. ETA somewhere in the fog between here and catastrophe. The general's oxygen sat was already 64 and falling, each number a countdown to cardiac arrest. The resident on call, a 3rd-year named Morrison, was frozen at the bedside with his hand on the general's shoulder, talking to him like volume could fix what was broken. "Hang on, sir. Help is coming. Just hang on." The help wasn't there yet. It was on the stairs, on the highway, somewhere in the distance. And in that space between now and arrival, a man was drowning in air that had gone to the wrong place. Hannah's hands moved. Not Hannah's thoughts, her hands. Muscle memory from another life, from training that lived in her fingers and her shoulders and the part of her brain that didn't require permission to function. She was already gloved. She was already reaching for the crash cart. The 14-gauge angiocath was exactly where it lived, in the front compartment, ready for emergencies that taught you what the difference between thinking and surviving meant. "I need him prepped," she said to the nurse beside her. Morrison turned like she'd spoken in another language. "We need to wait for the attending. The code team is minutes away. He's got seconds." She didn't ask again. She moved to the general's right side, her fingers finding the landmarks that had been drilled into muscle until they were more reliable than thought itself. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The cartilage ridge between the 2nd and 3rd ribs was like a map she'd memorized in another life, in a field hospital outside Ramadi with rounds still falling in the distance and a Marine with his lung collapsing just like this one. Pain was information. That's what the instructors had said. Pain tells you where you are, what you're doing, whether you're right. Her skin felt the difference in tissue as the needle went in. The resistance at the fascia. The sudden give. The hiss of air escaping. 02 Saturday. It was climbing. 64 to 70. The general's color was changing, that gray tomb-like quality bleeding back into living flesh. The monitor showed it before her eyes did. The oxygen was finding lungs now instead of the space around them. The numbers kept climbing. 75, 82, 88. The general's eyes were still open, shock wide, but the death rattle at his throat had stopped. He could breathe now. The trachea was sliding back where it belonged. "Get me a chest tube set up," Hannah said to no one in particular. 36 French, and I need it now. Morrison came unfrozen. "You can't, the attending needs to. The attending needs a patient who's still breathing." Her voice had dropped into a register she didn't use on this unit. "Get the setup. Move." The code team arrived at 0208 with running footsteps and shouted coordination. Dr. Brennan, the ICU attending, was there in scrubs that looked slept in, confusion still clouding his eyes until he saw the needle site, the improved SAT numbers on the monitor, the general's pupils reacting to light. He understood in seconds. The picture told him everything: the clinical intervention, the timing, the steady vitals where there should have been flat line. He looked at Hannah with something like recognition, but recognition of what, she couldn't let herself wonder. "Who did the decompression?" Brennan asked, already moving to place the chest tube, to do the next thing that needed doing. "Nurse Clarke," Morrison said quietly. Brennan nodded. "Good work. Let's get him fully drained and stabilized. 2 units of ONEG standing by." But the moment was already over. The code was controlled now. The general was breathing. The crisis had shape and protocol and chain of command that made sense on paper. Hannah stepped back, her hand still moving from muscle memory, her heart rate already dropping back toward baseline like it had never spiked at all. That was when Dr. Pierce walked through the ICU doors. He took in the scene in a single glance: the general's improved color, the monitors showing numbers that spelled survival instead of descent, the chest tube that Hannah had prepped the way someone would who had done this before. Before her shift at Seattle General. Before her 8 months of accepting humiliation and careful invisibility. His face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. The wrong kind. "Who performed the initial decompression?" he asked, already knowing. "Nurse Clarke," Brennan said again, distracted, focused on the chest tube placement that was his job, his purview, the thing he was supposed to be doing. Pierce's eyes found her in the crowd. "That was a reckless cowboy procedure," he said, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos like a scalpel. "A dangerous improvisation that violated every protocol we have. She's a floor nurse, not a trauma surgeon. This was textbook overreach, and if this goes sideways, it proves exactly what I've been saying about her credibility." The words landed in the room like dropped instruments. The general's oxygen was at 91 now and climbing. His heart rate was stable. His pupils were reactive. Every single objective measure said the woman standing 3 feet away had just bought him another day, another week, maybe another decade if the underlying condition didn't claim him. But Pierce wasn't finished. He was already pulling his phone from his pocket, already typing with the kind of furious precision that meant emails being drafted, allies being contacted, networks being activated. Within 6 hours, Hannah would learn, he'd reached out to board members who owed him favors, men and women from his residency, his golf club, his carefully maintained ecosystem of reciprocal obligation. He'd called her listed references with pointed questions designed to expose inconsistencies. "How long exactly did she work at your facility? Can you confirm her actual nursing license number? Does the timeline on her resume match your records?" Her intelligence handlers would have been trained for this. The cover references were assets, people who'd been briefed on limited disclosure protocols. But aggressive investigation ran the risk of triggering protocols, causing them to clam up, to refuse confirmation entirely. A negative reference was almost worse than no reference at all. By mid-morning, Pierce had already brought in Garrett from the state licensing board, a sharp-eyed investigator with the kind of authority that made administrators nervous. By noon, he'd filed a formal complaint about the unauthorized medical intervention performed by non-physician personnel and requested an immediate credential audit. He was being thorough. He was being competent. He was burning bridges with the precision of someone who'd already decided the structure needed to burn if it meant taking her with it. Hannah stood at the monitors and watched the general's vitals remain stable. Watched the numbers that meant her hands had remembered something true. Watched the world rearrange itself into danger with the casual inevitability of a stage set collapsing between acts. The folded flag was still in her pocket. The one from Raleigh. The one with a teenager's name stitched into the corner where nobody looked. She could feel it the way she could feel the rhythm of her own heartbeat, present, essential, carrying weight that no one else understood. By 1400, Linda Torres, the hospital administrator, called her into the office on the second floor. The kind of office with a window and uncomfortable chairs and the smell of institutional coffee that had been sitting in a carafe since before sunrise. Pierce was already there, leaning against the wall like he owned it, and beside him was Garrett, the licensing investigator, with a folder that looked 3 times thicker than it should have been after a single morning's work. "Ms. Clarke," Torres began, and the formality of it was itself a sentence. "We're placing you on immediate administrative suspension pending full credential verification. There are inconsistencies in your background that require investigation before you can continue working with patients." Pierce smiled. It was the smile of a man watching a chess piece being removed from the board. "I contacted 3 of your listed references," he said, reading from his phone with the satisfaction of a prosecutor presenting evidence. 2 don't recall you at all. The 3rd remembers someone by your name, but the timeline doesn't match your resume. Your work history has gaps. Your credentials don't fully track. In light of the unauthorized medical intervention this morning, we need to ensure you're actually licensed to perform the basic functions you claim to perform." Hannah felt the words like she felt most things these days, as information, data, pressure that needed to be assessed and filed and dealt with according to protocols she'd learned long ago. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask him to repeat himself. She simply looked at Torres and said, "I understand." "You'll need to surrender your badge," Torres said quietly. She looked almost apologetic, like she'd been pushed into this role, like she understood on some level that something important was happening and she was just the mechanism through which it was occurring. "Security will escort you out. And you're prohibited from patient contact, especially General Kaine. Dr. Pierce is having you flagged in the system." Hannah unclipped her badge from her scrubs. 47 weeks of careful work, condensed into a plastic rectangle with her photograph from before she'd started understanding what this job would cost her. She set it on Torres' desk without ceremony. She left without speaking. Without defending herself. Without explaining what couldn't be explained, without burning everything she'd been sent here to protect. The intelligence operation was classified. Her real credentials were classified. Her training was classified. Everything about her that mattered existed in a space where truth-telling meant operational failure, meant letting down the people who'd sent her here, meant the supply diversion that Dr. Pierce had personally architected would continue unchecked, moving pills and medications through his network like a pipeline into darkness. She drove home at 15:30. The city was rearranging itself around her the way it always did, indifferent, enormous, going about its business without recognizing that she'd just become invisible again, except this time, she'd been stripped of her cover while the real work remained incomplete. At home, she sat at her kitchen table with her face in her hands. The house was quiet in that way empty places are quiet, the kind of silence that comes from the absence of anything alive except you. She held the folded flag in her fist, tighter and tighter until the creases pressed into her palm like stigmata. 8 months. 8 months of listening to Pierce's contempt, of accepting being written off as incompetent, of maintaining cover in a hospital that had become a battleground between what she actually was and what she was allowed to show. The general was alive because of her. And now she couldn't protect him. At 0700 the next morning, when the sun came through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything look like it was drowning in sepia, Marcus found her still sitting there. Her 10-year-old son, with his father's eyes and her own stubborn jawline, stopped in the doorway with his backpack in one hand and confusion spreading across his face like weather. "Mom." His voice was small. Uncertain. The voice of a child who'd never seen his mother broken before. "Why are you home? Are you sick?" Hannah looked at him and felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking, exactly, but shifting, the way ice shifts when the pressure underneath becomes too much to sustain. She had no answer that didn't compromise operational security. No truth that would make sense to a 10-year-old who still believed his mother was just a nurse, just a person with a regular job and regular problems and regular reasons for sitting at a kitchen table crying before sunrise. "Just tired, baby," she said. It was the only honest thing she could tell him. Just really tired. He came to her and wrapped his arms around her neck, and she held him like he was the only real thing left in a world that had become shadows and protocols and calculations about what could be sacrificed and what couldn't. His hair smelled like the apple shampoo from the grocery store. His skin was warm. His arms were small and true and uncomplicated by anything except the simple fact of loving his mother. She held him and didn't let go. The folded flag was still clenched in her other hand, pressed into her fist so hard the corners had left marks in her palm. A name. A teammate. A weight that neither broken protocols nor administrative suspensions could lift from the places where she carried it. Administrator Linda Torres's office smelled like burnt coffee and the kind of silence that precedes disaster. Hannah sat in a chair that faced 3 people, Torres behind the desk, Dr. Pierce to her right with his arms crossed, and a woman with a state licensing investigator's badge clipped to her lanyard. The woman's name was Margaret Chen. Her eyes had already made up their mind. "Captain," Torres began, then corrected herself. "Hannah. We received the external investigator's report this morning." Hannah's hands rested in her lap. Still. Composed. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Chen opened a folder. "Your credentials are incomplete. References don't align with your timeline. One contact number leads to a disconnected line." She looked up. 3 months ago you were supposedly working at Denver Memorial. No employment record exists. "I need to explain," Hannah started. "You can't," Pierce cut in, his voice sharp with vindication. "Not without admitting you fabricated everything. Your references, your experience, your supposed nursing background." Torres leaned forward. "Hannah, I've known you for 8 months. You're a good person. A good nurse. But I can't protect you without answers." She paused. "Why did you lie to get here?" Hannah's jaw tightened. 1 beat. 2. The fluorescent light above them hummed its electric frequency, steady as a heartbeat monitor. She couldn't tell them the truth. Couldn't say the words that would end 8 months of classified groundwork. Couldn't mention Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or Operation Nightingale, or the supply diversion ring that had been running through Seattle General's pharmacy for 14 months, siphoning medications worth millions. Couldn't explain that her references were classified, that her timeline didn't exist in civilian databases because it existed in Pentagon files. Couldn't say that General Robert Kaine, the man lying in room 407 with a tension pneumothorax she'd decompressed at 0200, was the reason she'd been embedded here at all. The diversion ring supply chain ran through his former command structure. His hospital visit wasn't coincidence. It was operational. One false word, one classified detail slipped, and the investigation would shift from her to federal jurisdiction. The entire network would collapse. Months of surveillance would evaporate. The people actually responsible, the ones moving millions in stolen medications to black market clinics across the Carolinas, would scatter like roaches when the lights came on. So Hannah said nothing. "I can't discuss my background," she said quietly. The first true thing she could offer. "I understand how that looks." Pierce smiled. The expression of a man who'd already won. Incompetent and deceptive. Torres's face tightened. "Hannah, as of right now, you're on immediate administrative suspension pending the outcome of this investigation. You'll need to surrender your badge, your access credentials, and any hospital property in your possession." Hannah reached for the badge hanging around her neck. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd disassembled rifles in the dark, who'd started fours in dust storms, who'd held her composure while her son's squad leader bled out in her arms. The badge came free. She set it on Torres's desk. The plastic made a soft clicking sound against the wood. "You're making a mistake," Pierce said, almost conversational now. "She's dangerous. Unqualified. Probably criminal. And you just let her." "That's enough, Doctor," Torres said. She didn't look at him. She was looking at Hannah, searching for something: guilt, anger, fear. She found none of those things. What she found was a woman who looked like she'd been through worse and knew how to survive it. Security arrived to escort Hannah out. 2 officers, neither of whom met her eyes. They walked her through hallways where she'd spent 8 months learning names, learning rhythms, learning which nurses took breaks at what times, which doctors cut corners on documentation, which supply orders didn't match actual inventory. She passed the break room where staff scattered like her presence was contagious. Past the pharmacy window where a technician quickly looked away. Past room 407 without looking in. The drive home took 18 minutes. Hannah didn't play music. Didn't call anyone. Just drove through rain that hammered the windshield like applause for a performance no one was supposed to witness, her hand steady on the wheel even as everything else crumbled. Her apartment was a studio on the 2nd floor of a complex that catered to medical professionals. Clean. Sparse. No photographs. No personal details that a background check would find. She sat at her kitchen table at 1847 hours and put her face in her hands. The rain continued outside. Relentless. Thunder rolled across Raleigh like distant artillery, and Hannah sat motionless, her shoulders bearing the weight of classified missions and suspended licenses and a 10-year-old boy who would come home from his father's house tomorrow and ask why Mommy wasn't at work. She didn't cry. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear, it was restraint. At 0700 the next morning, her son Marcus found her in that same chair, dawn light filtering through cheap blinds, her face shadowed and exhausted. He was small for his age, still wore Spider-Man backpack, still believed his mother was invincible. "Mom." His voice was uncertain. "Why are you home? You always work nights." Hannah looked at him. At the gap in his front teeth from losing the baby canine last month. At the way he held his backpack strap like a security blanket. At the fact that she'd built an entire operation on lies while trying to raise a son who deserved truth. "I had to take some time," she said. The only answer that didn't compromise everything. "Are you sick?" Marcus moved closer. His hand reached out to touch her shoulder. Hannah pulled him against her chest, and for the first time in 8 hours, something cracked. Not publicly. Not visibly. Just internally, that hairline fracture in the composure that no one else would ever see. "No, buddy." She pressed her face into his hair. "I'm not sick." He didn't ask more questions. He just sat with her as the rain continued outside, the kind of child's wisdom that understands when words won't help. Later, after she'd gotten him breakfast and his father had picked him up for school, Hannah went to her bedroom closet and found the small wooden box where she kept her private things. Handful of letters. A photograph of her son at 3 years old. And the folded flag, the one she'd carried since Ramadi, tricolored and pressed, belonging to Petty Officer First Class David Chen, her teammate, who died in her arms on March 15, 2007, with a sucking chest wound and a request that Hannah take care of his daughter back home. She held the flag in her fist and sat on the edge of the bed, wondering if she'd failed both missions at once. The one in Ramadi, where she'd promised to keep them safe. And the one here in Raleigh, where she was supposed to dismantle a criminal network and protect a hospital that had just thrown her out. But that wasn't the worst part. The phone rang at 0820. Hannah's number on the screen of a blocked caller, and when she answered, Administrator Torres's voice came through measured and institutional. "Ms. Clarke, you're cleared to return to Seattle General at 0900 to collect your personal belongings. Security will escort you. 30 minutes maximum." The line went dead. She dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a gray sweater, boots worn at the heel from 1,000 shifts she might never work again. The drive to Raleigh took 23 minutes. She counted them. 2 security guards met her at the employee entrance, their badges clipped to polo shirts, their expressions carefully neutral. They didn't speak. Nobody spoke to her now. The corridors of the ICU felt longer than they had during her 8 months here, the linoleum stretching like a runway she was being escorted from, not into. Her locker on the 3rd floor held 8 months of a life that was already becoming someone else's memory, scrub jacket with a small coffee stain on the cuff, a paperback novel she'd never finished, 3 pens that had rolled loose across the metal bottom. She was zipping the bag when the code blue was called. Not for her. For someone else. For the 4th floor. She watched the guards' postures relax slightly, their attention drifting. Muscle memory told her to move. 12 years of muscle memory. She was 3 steps toward the stairwell when one guard's radio crackled with an alert. General Kaine's room, 4th floor, consciousness returning, all vitals trending toward normal. The guards didn't try to stop her. She was already gone. The general lay in his hospital bed with his eyes flickering like he was surfacing from deep water, his chest rising with steady rhythm, his color no longer the ash gray of a dying man. His daughter sat in the visitor's chair, phone clutched to her chest. When Hannah entered, the general's eyes locked on her face. His lips moved. His voice came out sandpaper rough but crystalline clear, Reaper. The word hung in the air like a dropped stone breaking water. The daughter's head snapped up. A Marine colonel standing at the foot of the bed, visiting from Walter Reed, his dress blues immaculate, went rigid. His hand moved to his jacket pocket and came out with a general service file, laminated documents thick with redaction markings. He read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of official record, citation for extraordinary heroism under fire, Ramadi, Jolin District, May 2008. Captain Hannah Clarke, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Actions resulting in preservation of command structure and protection of forward operational position. 2 silver stars. He paused. His eyes found Hannah's. And a Navy Cross. The room contracted around those words. The general's daughter made a sound like a question she didn't have the language to ask. Hannah's hands were steady. Her breathing unchanged. The only thing that moved was her jaw, flexing once, hard enough to hurt. The door burst open. Dr. Pierce, his coat flapping like wounded wings, his face purple-blotched with something that used to be authority but had curdled into desperation. Security. Remove her. Now. She has no clearance to be in this room, no credentials to stand in this hospital, and I have documented, his voice cracked. The colonel didn't even look at him. Didn't acknowledge his existence. Within an hour, the air pressure in the room changed. A 2-star general from Bethesda walked through the door with 3 Marine staff officers trailing. He was old enough that his call sign predated most combat operations post-2001, his chest bearing medals that caught the fluorescent light like promise and sacrifice bound together. He looked at Hannah, and without ceremony, he saluted, hand to temple, the kind of salute you give to those who've bled for the flag. She returned it, her arm moving with a muscle memory that never leaves your body even when your life is pretending to be someone else. Captain Clarke. His voice was gravel and authority. Is Operation Nightingale compromised? Hannah's voice dropped an octave when she answered. Mission timeline accelerated but parameters maintained, sir. Supply diversion network still contained. No additional exposure. Your cover? Burned. But deliberately. Target will self-destruct. She didn't look at the door where Dr. Pierce had been. Didn't need to. She could smell his absence like ozone after a defibrillator charge. The general nodded once. He turned to Administrator Torres, who had appeared in the doorway with the look of someone watching their hospital being dismantled by people with authority she suddenly understood she didn't possess. Nurse Clarke is a decorated combat officer on active classified duty. The investigation into her credentials is concluded. Effective immediately, she is reinstated with full hospital privileges pending her discretionary timeline. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and it landed in the room like something that couldn't be unsaid. Torres's face went pale. She nodded. She had no choice. What happened next took 48 hours. The external investigation that Dr. Pierce had weaponized against Hannah pivoted with the precision of a blade turning in flesh. State auditors pulled his supply records. They found 73 falsified requisitions with his signature beside them. Controlled substances ordered for post-surgical patients who were never admitted to the hospital. Surgical equipment signed out to departments that never received deliveries. All of it routed through vendors that existed only on paper, shell companies with addresses that led to empty office parks. Kickback payments to an account under his ex-wife's maiden name, deposits totaling $287,000 over 18 months. He hadn't just been corrupt. He'd been efficiently, methodically, professionally corrupt. The same precision he'd applied to destroying Hannah applied to destroying himself. The board members he'd called in favors from scrubbed his name from committees within 6 hours. Their voicemails and emails requesting he make the problem go away were entered as evidence of obstruction. His medical license was suspended pending criminal proceedings. The state medical board moved with the speed of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to prove they took violation seriously. 6 weeks later, Hannah stood at the hospital window watching the white medical supply van pull into the loading bay. Dr. Pierce climbed out of the passenger seat wearing civilian clothes that hung loosely on his frame like he'd shrunk inside himself. His court-ordered community service uniform was a white polo shirt 2 sizes too large. 2,000 hours at a free clinic on the south side of Raleigh, serving the homeless population, every decision reviewed, every action supervised. The man who'd built his entire identity on status and authority now measured out blood pressure medication in a strip mall clinic to people he'd once looked through like they were furniture. He saw Hannah watching and his face twisted, not with anger, but with something hollow and final. The look of someone who'd destroyed himself and was only now understanding the weight of what he'd done. She didn't smile. Didn't move. Just stood there with that same flat, cold assessment she'd given him every time he'd tried to break her. Then she turned away. The elevator climbed to the 4th floor. The ICU hummed with the sound of machines that sounded like breathing, like living, like continuation. General Kaine sat up in his bed for the first time on his own power, color returned to his face, chest rising with strength that hadn't been there when Hannah arrived 8 months ago. His daughter stood beside him, hand on his shoulder. She looked at Hannah when the door opened and her face shifted, recognition, shame, understanding in that order. "Captain Clarke, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. The things Dr. Pierce said about you." Hannah shook her head. "You were protecting your father. Nothing to apologize for." Her voice carried the weight of command and something underneath it that sounded like permission to let go of guilt. She reached into her pocket. The folded flag came out, small, precise triangles of fabric the color of blood and memory. Not her son's flag. Her son had come home breathing, wounded but alive. This flag belonged to Corporal James Martinez, who died at 0247 on May 14, 2008, holding a pressure dressing on General Kaine's femoral artery while Hannah returned fire with her offhand and screamed for medevac. Martinez had kept the general alive long enough for the helicopter. He deserved to be here when the general walked out of this hospital. She placed the flag on the bedside table. The general's eyes filled. His hand moved to touch the fabric like it was sacred, like it was prayer made physical. "Martinez. God. I didn't know you still." His voice broke. "I thought, after all these years. He kept you alive long enough, sir. He deserves to be here when you walk out." Hannah stood at attention for exactly 3 seconds, then relaxed her posture. "Rest, sir. Physical therapy starts tomorrow at 0600. She turned to leave. The general's daughter was crying. His daughter was crying and the general was holding a flag that belonged to someone who died so he could live, and Hannah walked back into the corridor where the night shift was beginning and nobody whispered anymore when she passed them. They nodded. They moved aside. They asked permission. In Administrator Torres's office, 6 weeks later, Hannah received the official commendation. Operation Nightingale concluded successfully. Supply diversion ring dismantled. 11 arrests across 4 states. $2.3 million in recovered equipment and medications. Her cover was burned, but the mission was complete, and Torres offered her a position, clinical director, ICU, permanent, her real credentials now public record, her military experience no longer classified. The staff who'd avoided her now brought coffee with stammered apologies. The resident who'd mocked her requested a transfer. Karen from the break room actually smiled. But the invisibility that had let her work was gone, replaced by deference that created its own kind of distance. General Kaine was discharged on a Tuesday morning, walking on his own power, his daughter beaming, the flag from Martinez carefully folded in his jacket pocket. Hannah met them at the exit. The general had regained 15 pounds. His command presence had returned intact. He saluted her formally and she returned it, crisp and exact. "Captain Clarke, I owe you my life twice. Ramadi and here." Hannah shook her head. "You gave the orders that brought my son home alive, sir. We're even." The weight of that statement settled between them like something that didn't need repeating. His daughter handed Hannah an envelope. The paper felt expensive, the weight suggesting substance beneath the surface. A letter of recommendation. For whatever comes next. Hannah took it without opening it, knowing it would matter someday when she was ready to be found again. She watched their car drive away. The medical supply van pulled into the loading bay, Pierce completing another day of court-ordered service, his face haggard. He saw her and looked away quickly. She didn't stop. Didn't engage. Just continued inside to the ICU, where there was always another shift, always another mission, always another person who needed someone who refused to quit. In the break room, a new night shift nurse sat down across from her hesitantly. Young. Idealistic. Terrified. "Captain Clarke? I read about what you did. In Ramadi. Here. It's incredible." Hannah looked at her, really looked, seeing the beginning of a story that hadn't learned its ending yet. She thought of Martinez. Of General Kaine. Of her son coming home with shrapnel in his leg and breath in his lungs. Of all the reasons you wear the uniform, whether it's digital camouflage or scrubs. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," Hannah said quietly. "Remember that when it gets hard. Because it will get hard." The young nurse nodded, not fully understanding yet but knowing someday she would. Hannah finished her coffee. Checked the folded flag one last time. She'd return it to Martinez's mother tomorrow with the story of how her son's courage saved a general, how his name mattered, how his blood still moved through these halls in the decisions being made, the lives being saved, the fights being won by people who refused to give up when giving up looked reasonable. She stood, straightened her uniform, and headed back to the floor. If you've made it this far, you already know the power of refusing to be defined by someone else's judgment. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who change everything from the margins. Like this if you've ever been underestimated. Comment, who's someone in your life who turned out to be far more than anyone realized?